Okay, so this video is going to be an overview of the Anglo Zulu War, the causes of the war, what happened during the war, and the consequences of the war, the consequences that the war had on the region. So, why did the British Empire go to war with the Zulu Kingdom? How was the war fought? What were the battles? And when the war was over, what impact did it have on the region? What happened to the Zulus? What did the British do with them after they had defeated the Zulus in the Anglo Zulu War? But it's also going to be an experimentation with ChatGPT's feedback when asking it questions about South African history. I know from past experience, students whose assignments were flagged for the use of AI had made the same mistakes. And in that question, which was, I asked them to compare the transatlantic slave trade to the slave trade that had existed in the Dutch Cape Colony, or the slave trade that the Dutch had introduced to the colony they created in the Cape. Students made same fundamental mistakes about Dutch slavery, and I anticipate that's a consequence of ChatGPT's lack of ability to provide feedback on a topic in South African history that is not that as well known. Now, with the topic of the Anglo Zulu War, I anticipate that we'd get much better feedback because this is a very famous war that has been very widely written about. There's movies about it, I'm sure there's video games about it, and part of the reason is because this was the British Empire at its peak. It was the most sophisticated empire at this point in time. It had the most state-of-the-art weapons, and the idea that they could be defeated in a place in southern Africa by an army who were armed predominantly with spears was just so crazy when it happened that it made the war very, very famous. Not only did the Zulus defeat a British army at the Battle of Asantlewana and just kill every single British white soldier, some of the native contingent who were fighting on behalf of the British, they fled earlier, but every British white soldier who was not on horseback died during this war, during this battle. Not only did the Zulus win that major battle, but that battle and the defeat that the British faced in that battle also actually changed the course of the war. The British had initiated this war expecting it to be over very quickly. That battle happened and it halted everything. So because of the fact that you've got this group in South Africa armed predominantly with spears fighting against the biggest empire in the world at that time with the most sophisticated firearms in existence at that time, was something that made this war very famous. So it will be interesting to see how ChatGPT responds to some questions about this war. So for the first question, what caused the Anglo Zulu War? What caused the Anglo Zulu War? Now we will see the type of feedback that we get. So the Anglo Zulu War, which took place in 1879, was primarily caused by a combination of political, economic, and territorial factors, as well as a misunderstanding and tensions between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom. Here are some key factors that contributed to the outbreak of the war. I'm not entirely sure what is meant by misunderstandings and tensions between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom. The tensions part I can understand, the misunderstandings I'm not sure. During the course of the war, you could speak about misunderstandings. British had made a number of miscalculations that led to some of the early disasters that they faced. But as far as the causes of the war goes, it's not entirely accurate to say misunderstandings. The cause of the war was a deliberate plan to bring about confederation. So in Canada, Lord Carnarvon, the British Secretary for Colonies, had brought about confederation, and he had united various territories to bring about the Confederation of Canada. And he thought a similar plan would be able to be implemented in South Africa. Why? Because just before this war, diamonds were discovered. In 1867, a young boy named Erasmus Jacobs was playing with the diamond. Another story for another day. That was discovered to be a diamond. He had originally just played with it as a random stone. It initiated a diamond rush. Eventually, it would lead to, by the 1870s, the creation of the town of Kimberley and initiate the mineral revolution. Due to the potential mineral wealth of the region of Southern Africa, people like Lord Carnarvon felt that confederation would be the best way forward. Now, prior to this, South Africa at this stage consisted of a number or patchwork of different states, so to speak, or groupings. You've got European colonies, you've got independent Africans in a all patchwork or collection of states. And the idea, now that diamonds have been discovered, you could bring about confederation, unite the region under British rule, and Britain will be able to have access to the mineral wealth. So that is really, it's not a misunderstanding. It was kind of a deliberate plan. Now, why did this lead to the Anglo Zulu War? Because Lord Carnarvon appointed Sir Henry Bartle Frere as High Commissioner of the Cape Colony. We'll get to, during this video, I'll explain the various units that made up Southern Africa. But Sir Henry Bartle Frere was, as High Commissioner of the Cape, he was in charge of bringing about this policy of confederation. Carnarvon had tried, he had invited various European delegates in Southern Africa. No one was interested in confederation, so he sent Sir Henry Bartle Frere to Southern Africa with the goal of bringing it about. If he could bring out this policy of confederation, uniting the various regions into one British confederation, then he would be appointed as Governor General of this South African, this British controlled South Africa. So that was his goal. Now, Sir Henry Bartle Frere identified a number of obstacles standing in the way of this policy of confederation. One obstacle were the two Boer republics, the other were the Zulu Kingdom. With their army of approximately 35,000 men, this was seen as a threat to the plan of confederation. So Sir Henry Bartle Frere had to initiate a war with the Zulus, or find a way of undermining their independence. And that is ultimately the cause of the war, because they were perceived as a threat to the plan of confederation. Okay, so ChatGPT says here are some key factors that contributed to the outbreak of the war. 1. British imperialism. The British Empire had been expanding its influence and territories in Southern Africa throughout the 19th century. They sought to consolidate their control over the region, which often led to conflicts with indigenous African kingdoms and chieftaincies, including the Zulu Kingdom. I don't like this answer because it's too vague or incomplete. It doesn't really explain why in 1879 did the British decide to initiate this war, just to say the British imperialism during the 19th century. The diamond discoveries are very important. So some contextual information is crucial if you're going to actually explain why British imperialism led to this war with the Zulu. Because British imperialism began in the region much earlier. In 1795, the British had taken what was originally the Dutch Cape Colony. So just a bit of background information. In 1652, under the Dutch East India Company, a little settlement was established at the Cape. This expanded into a colony. By 1795, during the wars with Napoleon, the British came to and took that colony from the Dutch to prevent it from going into French hands. During the course of the Napoleonic Wars, they had handed the colony back to the Dutch, but then come back a second time. By 1815, the British had made this a permanent British Cape Colony. And due to British rule, and I'm going to simplify extensively, it led to a situation where some of the original European inhabitants, who were made up of German, French, and Dutch ancestry, now calling themselves the Boers, had embarked on the Great Treks and explored other regions of what is today South Africa, what we all just call Southern Africa. And they had established a number of republics, the Republic of Natalia, the Orange Free State, and the South African Republic, which later became known as the Transvaal. The British eventually took that Republic of Natalia, annexed it, made it a British Natal colony. So the region in southern Africa consisted of a number of still independent African kingdoms and 4 European colonies, 2 Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, and 2 British colonies, the Cape Colony and Natal. Now, in 1867, with the diamond discoveries, some British officials or colonial officials like Carnarvon began to look at the region in a different way. And this idea of having this patchwork was not ideal to them. Rather, bring about a British Confederation under British control, and you can better control those mineral resources. And Henry Bartle Frere, appointed by Carnarvon to come to South Africa to bring about this confederation, had identified the Zulus and the Boers as an obstacle to this plan of confederation. And hence, the Anglo Zulu War was about removing one of those obstacles. So it was really in the aftermath of the diamond discoveries that this vague point that says British imperialism fails to take into account. Lord Carnarvon himself had actually invited someone from the Free State, Transvaal, Natal, and the Cape. The Cape did not send a delegation to meet him. The Orange Free State sent someone to reject it. Transvaal ignored it completely. Natal sent Theophilus Shepstone. Basically, it wasn't successful, so he put Henry Bartle Frere in South Africa to bring this about. Henry Bartle Frere identifies the Zulu as an obstacle and the cause of the war. Okay, the next point. Disputed border. A significant source of tension was the disputed border between the British Natal and the Zulu Kingdom. The British annexion of the Transvaal in 1877 and their continued encroachment into Zulu territory were viewed with suspicion by the Zulu, who saw their independence and sovereignty threatened. Again, this point is just very vague. The British annexion of the Transvaal in 1877 itself was a consequence of Sir Henry Bartle Frere's plan of bringing about confederation. And to just phrase this like this doesn't really explain the cause of the war. So when Sir Henry Bartle Frere arrived in South Africa, he had identified various obstacles. One was the Zulu, but the other was the Boer republics, particularly the Transvaal. And a delegation was sent by, a force under Theophilus Shepstone was sent to the Transvaal to annex it. And they did. Now, why would the Transvaal just surrender to the British when they did not like the British? Because at this point in time, they were fighting a war with the Petty. And they just lost a major battle to the Petty. And there were all these border skirmishes with the Zulus. So to fight a war with the Petty, the Zulu, and the British at the same time was obviously not practical. So the British annexed the Transvaal. The British would take out the Petty, take out the Zulu, and then the Transvaal would fight against the British to get their independence back. But that's beside the point. But this happened just before the Anglo Zulu War, British annexion of Transvaal. To make this point more accurate would rather be after the British annexion of the Transvaal. Theophilus Shepstone's stance to the Zulu had changed. Now, again, just more background information. The Zulu Kingdom had emerged when Shaka had united the Nguni people under the Zulu banner and created the Zulu Kingdom. The northern Nguni people, during the Afrikaner, the wars, the consequence was the rise of the Zulu, and he was their first king. Obviously, he's not the first king of the tribe called the Zulu, but this kingdom that he created by uniting various groups, he became the king. And he was assassinated by his half-brother Dingaan at about the time that the Boers began to make inroads. Dingaan had border disputes and disagreements with the Boer leader, Piet Retief, had Piet Retief killed, led to a war between the Boers and the Zulus, Battle of Blood River. The Boers defeated the Zulus. Impande overthrew his brother Dingaan. It's made an agreement with the Boers. Later the British annexed the Natal, but Impande had made, very much simplifying a more complicated story, but he had allowed a number of Boer farmers to settle in some land north of the Zulu Kingdom. So you've got the British Natal colony, the Zulu Kingdom, and north of that the Transvaal. Now this is disputed territory, and the Boers were allowed to settle there, but they began to expand. And by the time that Mpande, Dingaan's half-brother, had passed away, Cetshwayo is now Mpande's son, the new king of the Zulu, the king who would be the king during the course of the Anglo Zulu War. This border dispute became an issue. Now, Theophilus Shepstone was originally on the side of the Zulus, but now that he was sent to the Transvaal and he annexed the Transvaal, he switched policy, he switched views, and now he is taking the side of the Transvaal Boers against the Zulus. So this becomes an opportunity now for Sir Henry Bartle-Frere and Theophilus Shepstone to use these border disputes to paint the Zulu in a very negative light. And they will attempt to do this and use it. It won't go successfully, but they will try to use this border disputes to paint the Zulu as a threat to peace in the region and initiate a type of war. The next point, the ultimatum and diplomatic failure. In January 1879, Sir Bartle-Frere, the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, issued an ultimatum to the Zulu king Cetshwayo, demanding that he disband his army and accept British control over Zululand. The ultimatum was rejected, and diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the dispute. Ultimatum and diplomatic failure is, again, not the best way of phrasing this, because this ultimatum is kind of like, think of this ultimatum that the British issued to the Zulu as being the same as the ultimatum that the Austro-Hungarian Empire issued Serbia when Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was an ultimatum where it was designed to be rejected. Had Serbia accepted that ultimatum, they would be undermining their existence as a sovereign state. Had they rejected it, it would give Austria-Hungary an excuse to go to war with Serbia and basically end up initiating the First World War. The Anglo Zulu War is similar. They issued this ultimatum to the Zulus with the intention that if the Zulus accepted, some of the clauses, there's 13 points that the Zulus were forced to accept. Some of the clauses were, had the Zulus accept, like disband the army, send the soldiers to go back to home, it is really removing the Zulus as a threat to Sir Henry Bartle-Frere and Lord Carnarvon's confederation plans. Now, obviously the ultimatum, they anticipated that it would be rejected. This would give them an excuse to go to war with the Zulu. Now, this point again doesn't really explain fully the cause of the war, because the border disputes that were happening between the Zulu and the Transvaal, this was used by Sir Henry Bartle-Frere to paint the Zulu as a threat to peace, and a commission met, administered by the British Cape Colony, and they actually ruled in favor of the Zulus and found that the Zulus were not in violation of border disputes with the Transvaal Boers, but it was actually the Transvaal Boers, if anything, after the commission went through the evidence, who were in violation. So this was an obstacle to Sir Henry Bartle-Frere, but opportunities presented themselves to him. There were two in particular border disputes. One was a Swazi king, Impalini. Now, Swaziland is a state, it's another story for another day, but one of the princes or the king's sons who was sent in exile was given some land by the Zulu king Cetshwayo in what the British would regard as disputed territory between the Zulu and Natal border. And he gets accused of cattle theft. And this would be blamed on Cetshwayo. It would be used as an opportunity. And then another opportunity arose where, in Zulu custom, adultery is an offense that is punishable with death sentence, basically. And a very important Zulu chief, Sahayo, two of his wives had committed adultery. But now with this Natal border adjacent to the Zulu, they fled Zulu Kingdom, entered into Natal, maybe promise or belief that they would have colonial protection against the Zulu. Sahayo decided not to retaliate, and he left the matter as is. But when he was meeting the Zulu king Cetshwayo, his son and one of his brothers decided to take matters into their own hand, go into Natal, capture the two women, bring them back with the individuals they were having affairs with, bring them back into Zululand, and basically kill them. So these two incidences would provide Sir Henry Bartle-Frere with the opportunity to issue an ultimatum to the Zulus and he was able to exercise a lot of autonomy in Southern Africa. The British central government back in London would not really approve this, because at this point in time, one of the reasons I didn't like the point number one, British imperialism, is that the British back in London are not that interested in expanding in Southern Africa. They're more preoccupied with events in Asia, India, Afghanistan, etc. But Sir Henry Bartle Frere is able to operate with a lot of autonomy in South Africa, especially in this point in time where it takes messages a very long time from London to reach the Cape. And he's able to use this to his advantage, to unilaterally issue this ultimatum to the Zulu, hoping the Zulu would reject it, give him an excuse to go to war with the Zulu, win the war, and defeat the Zulus before any pushback from London. And this is basically his plan. So this instance of border disputes was an opportunity for Sir Henry Bartle Frere to find an excuse to go to war with the Zulus, which he uses an ultimatum to do so. So he issues this ultimatum. The ultimatum is designed to be rejected. Okay, the next point that ChatGPT mentions, miscommunication and misunderstanding. Miscommunication and misunderstanding on both sides further exasperated the situation. For example, the Zulus may not have fully comprehended the seriousness of the British ultimatum, and the British may not have fully appreciated the potential military strength of the Zulus. I don't think this is a good way of explaining the cause of the Zulu War, miscommunication and misunderstanding. As I've already explained, there was a deliberate plan by Sir Henry Bartle Frere to provoke the Zulus into a war. It was calculated, it was planned. The Zulus may have not fully comprehended the seriousness of the British ultimatum. King Cetshwayo did, but from his perspective, if you accept this ultimatum, you're undermining your sovereignty. And he didn't reject the ultimatum, he did not respond. This was an illegitimate thing, but from his perspective, you're either going to undermine Zulu's sovereignty, pave the way for British control over the Zulu Kingdom through this ultimatum, or you have a war. So he made it quite clear that he's fighting a defensive war. Obviously knows that with British superior firepower, it's unlikely that the Zulus are going to go invade Natal and win. So it's very much a defensive war. They are minding their own business. They issued this ultimatum. They will ignore this ultimatum. The British will invade. They will defend themselves. I would not say that the Zulus do not comprehend the seriousness of the ultimatum. They had pretty much no option but to defend themselves. British may not have fully appreciated the potential military strength of the Zulu. Well, the British did understand the military power of the Zulus, which is one of the reasons they wanted a war with the Zulus, because their very existence was an obstacle to plans of confederation. They made a number of underestimations, which led to a number of disasters early on in the war. For example, maybe this is a point I should get into later in this video when we get to the actual cause of the war, but the British commander who was in charge of leading this force, Chelmsford, he had recently fought wars in what is today the Eastern Cape against the amaXhosa, and the tactics that the amaXhosa used were very different to the types of tactics that the Zulus used. So he chose to split his army up into, believing that the Zulus would mount hit and run offenses, thought the tactic would be to split his forces up into a number of prongs. He would have a 5-prong invasion into Zululand. But one of the major mistakes that he made, and this isn't, again, I would not say that this is a cause of the war, but one of the mistakes he made during the war by underestimating the Zulus is that the Boers had successfully defeated the Zulus by fortifying themselves. They arranged their ox wagons in a laager formation, basically created a defensive barrier, so Zulus who are armed predominantly with spears would have to try to penetrate that barrier while being shot at. This was the most effective way of a small force of Europeans armed with guns fighting a large force of Africans armed with spears. Chelmsford did not take adequate precautions. The first major defeat that the British would have in this war, Battle of St. Luana, he left Henry Pulleine in charge of the camp at St. Luana and did not give Pulleine proper instruction. Pulleine himself did not decide to fortify their position. So they were basically out in the open. And when the Zulu force attacked, that was one of the reasons that they could have, well, that's one of the reasons that they were able to do what they did to the British. Later on in the war, he will learn the mistake and actually position ox wagons in a way that if they get attacked, it's very easy to form a kind of defensive barrier. Next point, imperial rivalry. There were also rivalries within the British Empire. Some officials in South Africa had their own agenda and were eager to assert British dominance over the region. This contributed to the decision to go to war. Just a bit too vague. So far, this ChatGPT answer doesn't really give you a real clear summary of the cause of the war. Yes, there were some British officials who wanted a war. There were some who pushed it. Lord Carnarvon, Sir Henry Bartle Frere. Most at this point in time were actually opposed to a war with the Zulus. Later on, individuals like Cecil John Rose would have a similar desire. With minerals in South Africa, some British imperialists believed that you could have a situation where you could have a British-controlled Southern Africa, and with a large native population, you could put an end to their independence, hence what would happen with the Zulus, tax them through taxation, force them to provide labor, cheap source of labor, to work on mines, to extract the minerals, to create enormous amounts of profit. Okay, war began in 1879 when British forces invaded Zululand. The Zulus mounted a defense. The conflict resulted in a series of battles, with the most famous being the Battle of Asante Luwana and the Battle of Rocks Drift. The war concluded in July 1879 with the defeat of the Zulu Kingdom and the capture of King Tswayo. The British subsequently divided Zululand into smaller territories under their control. I asked ChatGPT about the causes. This is a kind of quick summary of the war. Basically, it's adequate. The Anglo Zulu War had significant consequences for both the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom, as it marked a further step in British expansion in southern Africa and the eventual demise of the Zulu state. Yeah, all right. But let's ask it about a bit more detailed question about what actually happened during the war. Also, maybe we'll come back to this with asking questions about the motives. Hopefully we get a better answer than the first answer we got. First answer we got is kind of true, but it's just not detailed enough. Right. What happened during the war between the British and the Zulu? The Anglo Zulu War, which took place from January to July 1879, was a series of military engagements between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa. Here are some key events and battles that occurred during the war. 11th of January 1879, basically on the 11th of December 1878, this is when the ultimatum was issued to the Zulu, so there was the Zulu were given 20 days to respond to this, which they did not, and it was extended to another 10 days, and once that had expired, the British basically would invade Natal. The invasion of Zululand. Point 1. The war began in January 1879 when British forces under the command of Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand from the British colony of Natal. They aimed to defeat the Zulu army and bring the Zulu under British control. Okay, pretty straightforward, pretty accurate. Battle of Asante Luwana. Okay, we're jumping now to the Battle of Asante Luwana. Just some things to take note of. Chelmsford, as I mentioned earlier, believed that the Zulus would fight a hit and run type of offensive, so he thought that the real difficulty would be finding them. He wanted to end this war as quickly as possible. Chelmsford, a very experienced general, fought in the Crimean War, fought in the Indian Mutiny, fought in the frontier wars in the Cape, but now he believes that the Zulus would use similar tactics that the Xhosa did, and he decided to break his force into 5 prongs and invade Zululand. Did not have enough soldiers to do this, so he made it into a 3-prong invasion with kind of 2 reserve prongs. Now, that is how he invaded Zululand. Now, just before we get into this, just some detail which I think is important is that the British force, their advantage is that they can stay out in the field for a very long time. It's a professional force, professional soldiers. They travel with ox wagon, with food supplies, and they can. Their strategy is to find any deserted or European buildings in Zululand, like mission stations, set up camp, and march onto Elundi, believing the Zulus would be try to fight hit-and-run skirmishers, and that was their strategy. Their disadvantage is they move very, very slowly. The Zulu is a militia force, so obviously most of the men are farmers, but in times of war, they would join the army, and their duty to the state is to serve as a militia. Their advantage is that they move very quickly. They can quickly outmaneuver the British. Their scouting parties are much more sophisticated, but their limitation is that they can't be out on the battlefield for a very long time. Now, the Battle of Asantlewana, January 1879. This was one of the earliest and most significant battles of the war. A large British force, underestimating the strength and tactics of the Zulu warriors, was decisively defeated at Asantlewana. Approximately 1,300 British colonial soldiers were killed in battle, making it one of the worst defeats in British colonial history. Yeah, well, that's pretty much the Battle of Asantlewana. Earlier, so with this three-pronged invasion, Charles Pearson had set up a camp at Shawi. Evelyn Wood had set up a camp further north, and Chelmsford is taking the main army into Zululand. Makes a mistake and spots a small force of Zulus, decides to go and attack them. Leaves Pulain in charge of the camp back at Asantlewana. He goes out searching for Zulus. Later on, in one of the reserve flanks, led by Dunford, would help fortify Pulain's camp. They will spot a small force of Zulus, or what they would believe would be a small force of Zulus. Dunford, believing that this was an ambush to attack Chelmsford, decided to go out and attack this. And then he ends up stumbling across the main Zulu force, which will eventually be spotted and attack the camp at Asantlewana and basically wipe out the British force. The Battle of Rocks Drift. Battle of Rocks Drift is not really that significant as far as the war goes, but from the perspective of the British, it was very important, because in this Battle of Rocks Drift, especially after the disaster at Asantlewana, what the people who defended Rocks Drift did was extremely remarkable. And hence, to overcome the embarrassment at Asantlewana, they decide to really glorify what happened at Rocks Drift. What happened at Rocks Drift was incredible from the British perspective, but as far as the outcome of the war goes, it's not that significant. Basically, in the Battle of Asantlewana, the Zulus used the bullhorns formation, about 20,000 soldiers, chest, horns will encircle the enemy, and there'll be a reserve column in the back, which would be called the loins, whose job it would be to clean up what the main army, or serve as reserves if the main army is in trouble. During the Battle of Asantlewana, this group of reserves never saw combat. And after the Battle of Asantlewana was concluded, they, in violation of the instructions of Tletshwaya, who said this must always be a defensive war, not an offensive war, decided to go and attack the British mission station, well, the deserted mission station that the British had set up camp at Rocks Drift, which at this point in time is serving more as a hospital. Okay, Battle of Rocks Drift, January 22nd to 23rd, 1879. The battle took place on the same day as the Battle of Asantlewana. A small British garrison at the mission station of Rocks Drift successfully defeated against the Zulu attack. The defense of Rocks Drift became famous for its bravery and resilience, and was later depicted in the movie Zulu. Force of less than, about 100 British soldiers protected this, what is functioning more as a hospital, against a force of about 5,000 Zulus, fought throughout the night. But again, here is where the European forces excel, when they have a fortified position. On hearing, so what happened in the Battle of Asantlewana, as I say, most of the every white soldier who was not on horseback was killed during Asante Luwana. But a few survivors on horseback came to Rock's Drift to warn them. And the people in Rock's Drift had a very short time to fortify the position. And they did it using sacks of grain, biscuit boxes, did a good job creating a defensive perimeter. When the Zulus attacked at night, they were unable to penetrate this, and it ended up being a huge victory for the British. Well, a huge moral victory for the British. A tiny force defeats a huge force of the Zulus. But as far as the war goes, the British initial invasion plan had failed. Chelmsford, on hearing the news of the disaster at Asante Luwana, withdrew back to the Natal colony, and he abandoned the Charles Pearson's camp, who would now be besieged at Shawi, and he would wait there until he could get reinforcements to plan another invasion of Zululand. So the first invasion of Zululand is basically a failure. You've got Evelyn Wood, who's fortified in the north, Charles Pearson, who's stranded in the south, and Chelmsford, who has retreated back to the Natal border. Subsequent battles following the Battle of Asante Luwana, the British regrouped and launched a series of successful campaigns against the Zulus. They won battles at places like Kambula and Jindlovu. Capture of King Cetshwayo. In July 1879, British forces captured Zulu King Cetshwayo. This event marked a significant turning point in the war. The end of the war. With the capture of King Cetshwayo, the defeat of Zulu armies, the British had largely achieved the object of the war. The war officially ended in July 1879. The British then imposed their authority over Zululand. Okay, it does go through quite a bit of detail about the siege at Shawi and how Chelmsford would eventually have to go and rescue Pearson, plan another invasion, enter into Zululand. This time the British would learn the mistakes that they had made previously. When they enter into Zululand, they would go in a line with 2 ox wagons. Anytime they're attacked, it would be easy to close this off and create a defensive perimeter. It was only a matter of time before they were able to go out and basically defeat the Zulus at the Battle of Ulundi. Treaty of Ulundi. After the war, the British imposed the Treaty of Ulundi on the Zulu Kingdom, which effectively reduced Zululand to a British protectorate. Zululand was divided into 13 smaller chieftaincies under the control of a local chief who was loyal to the British. The Anglo Zulu War had significant consequences for both the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom. The defeat of the Zulus marked the end of their independence and the beginning of British colonial rule in the region. It also had lasting effects on the relationship between the British and the Zulu, as well as the broader history of Southern Africa. Okay, let's try asking it what were the consequences of the Anglo Zulu War and see what we get. The Anglo Zulu War had several significant consequences affecting both the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom, as well as the broader context of colonialism in Southern Africa. 1. British imperial control. One of the immediate outcomes of the war was the establishment of British imperial control over Zululand. The defeat of the Zulu Kingdom led to the annexion of the Zululand as a British colony in 1887. Okay, so just a bit of detail that could be mentioned. Sir Henry Bartle Frere was discharged of his duties and replaced by Sir Henry Garnet Wolseley during the war. Wolseley had arrived as the war was concluded, and he immediately abandoned the Confederation plans. But his plan for Zululand was to break it apart and divide it into 13 smaller units with a British appointed chief. Basically, the understanding is that these were the original leaders of the people prior to Shaka's wars of conquest that united the Zulus under Shaka. The problem was that there's just no evidence based on the British appointed chiefs. One of them was a Sotho, one of them was a white European trader named John Donne. So it was obviously just divide the Zulu Kingdom up, made them easier to control. That's why it was originally sent into exile. Later on, he would return, but by this time, the Zulu Kingdom would end up having a civil war, and he would be wounded and die during the course of the Civil War, and it would just pave the way for British final annexion in 1887. The division of Zululand was divided into smaller territories, each controlled by a local chief loyal to the British. Divisions weakened Zulu Kingdom's central authority and further eroded its independence. Yes. The end of Zulu independence. Zulu Kingdom, which had been a powerful and independent entity in southern Africa, lost its independence and was effectively placed under British control. King Cetshwayo was dethroned, and although he was eventually reinstated, his authority was greatly reduced. Land dispossession. British colonial administration implemented land policies that dispossessed the Zulus and of their ancestral land, which had significant and long-lasting effects on the Zulu people. Change in Zulu leadership. After the war, the British introduced a system of indirect rule in Zululand, which involved ruling through local chiefs who were loyal to the British. This system transformed traditional Zulu leadership and governance. Impact of Zulu society. The defeat and changes imposed by the British had social and cultural repercussions for the Zulu people. Their traditional way of life and societal structures were significantly disrupted. Well, basically, part of the whole wars of conquest is an indirect rule, erode the independence, break the Zulu Kingdom up into smaller units through taxation, forced labor, migrant labor, be very useful for the mines. Continued resistance. While Zulu Kingdom lost its independence, there were ongoing pockets of resistance and unrest against the British rule in Zululand, conflicts of the region. Okay, so basically, this just the rest of ChatGPT's answer just goes into some of the long-term repercussions. This was one of many wars of colonial conquest in the aftermath of the Mineral Revolution, which will ultimately culminate in what was known as the Second Anglo Boer War, or today the South African War, where the British went to war with the two Boer republics, 1899 to 1902, and ultimately united South Africa and created the Union of South Africa in 1910. So that's just basically ChatGPT's summary of the Anglo Zulu War. For the most part, pretty accurate, pretty good description of the Anglo Zulu War. Just some points, especially the causes of the war, were a bit vague. The actual battles of the war would be something that you could actually just ask ChatGPT further questions to elaborate here, elaborate there, and you might get slightly more detailed answers. So it's a topic that is with information as widely accessible on the internet, like the Zulu War, information is far more accurate than it was with something like the Dutch slave trade in the Cape.